to the topic of resilience. And I will basically outline a few principles that we learned over the past decade in the field of economic geography, economic complexity. And my goal is not going to show you some kind of rocket science, advanced research frontier, new papers, but basically take stock of what we know, what we've learned, and basically how to make it useful. Because one of the biggest challenges today for regions all over the world is actually to reinvent themselves. So based on all the knowledge that we have, how can we build tools that actually help regions, policymakers, all over the world to actually make this design of reinvention a little bit more smooth and efficient, and manage to flag hidden opportunities, and also to flag, to have like red flag when some strategies might be a little bit too ambitious and not grounded on some kind of evidence. So it connects very, very well to the topics of smart specialization that most of you might be familiar with. And I'm going to try not to talk too much. I'm just going to try to remain a bit high level in terms of like the principles that govern these ideas on how regions can reinvent themselves. And on the other hand, I like to leave a bit of space for discussion, because these tools are already being used, by some regions, trying out, and I think that there's also room for improvement. And I'll be very, very happy to receive your comments and questions. Actually have more like of a conversation with you than just lecturing and preaching, any kind of gospel. So that being said, I'm going to have some slides here that I'm going to share with you. And, oh, actually, I'm not sharing yet. Let me go back. Share here. Exactly. Okay, take two. You should see everything. Yes, I see Simon giving me a thumb up. So that's good. All right. So it's really about, let me see if I can minimize this one. Yes. Okay. So as I said, the overall topic is how regions can reinvent themselves. And I'm going to focus really a lot this talk on the role of complexity and relatedness, and show you basically how we've been developing some tools that really act as a recommendation system to basically help regions to design their strategy of reinvention, but also to implement it and to monitor, this strategy. So first of all, to set the stage a little bit of the question of reinvention at the regional level, I want to say that this is something that concerns absolutely every single region in the world right now. This is not something that is only connected to all industrial regions that are, struggling with some kind of old economic activities that became obsolete, or that lost in terms of market share. But it's something that really concerns like all regions. So of course, we all have in mind this all industrial regions that are struggling, like the regions in the north east of France, for instance, that lost a lot of their activity. We think of Detroit. So we all have this type of ideas in mind of struggling regions. But this is also true for regions that might be doing really, really well, but that need to diversify their activity, and that know that maybe some of their current portfolio is very dependent on prices that are very volatile, or a market demand that can change very quickly and switch to entirely new dimension. So they need to prepare themselves and actually think about developing new activities. I'm thinking about some regions in Australia, in Norway, in other countries that are in Canada, very much dependent on their natural resources. I'm also thinking about regions that are actually right now doing extremely well. So I'm originally from the city of Toulouse, and Toulouse is world famous because it's basically the place where Airbus has its headquarters. And right now, the market for planes is absolutely fantastic, and the city of Toulouse is one of the fastest growing in Europe right now. Well, thanks to the aerospace industry, which is doing really, really well. Why? Because Southeast Asia is growing very, very quickly and buying a lot of planes, right? So there is very little competition. So right now it's doing very well. We actually have like a shortage of skilled engineers, aerospace engineers, AI engineers in Toulouse at the moment. And the city is growing, generating a lot of revenue. And this is all really, really good. But one issue is also that the region is very much specialized around one specific industry, and a lot of jobs around the production of airplanes can actually move elsewhere And at the heart of the strategy of Toulouse right now is really about, focusing their core of economic activities on, for instance, on embedded systems, which is the brain of the airplane, and start, to think about letting go other part of the economic activities. So there's also this question of like recentering their activities on like some core industries that generate the most value added, and also expand around these embedded systems, around topics of AI and blockchain and other type of new technologies that could exploit what the city is doing right now, but in different contexts. So even in this context where the city at this moment is doing really, really well, there is this idea that this process of reinvention is really big, and also that you should not be dependent on a single industry, even though it's doing really well. So basically, it covers virtually every region right now, ranging from the region of Paris to region elsewhere, are very, very, very much focused on this idea of reinvention. And if you think about it in a very simple term, basically the wealth of cities basically is driven by some form of tides, some type of waves that is driven by the technology itself. So, if I cannot really show you with my finger, usually I show this with my finger or a pointer, but if you're like on this black line, and you see this moment where the technology is taking off, and the city is specialized, or the region is specialized on this technology, then it's really doing really, really well. But there is always a moment systematically where the technology starts to mature, competition arises from different places in the world, and at some point the technology actually goes down. So the city, the region has one choice: to actually remain on this technology and go up and down with it, or actually have this moment where, even though things are going really, really well, you still try to open up and think about new possibilities, because you know that in the long run, the technology will go down and you have to switch the wave. So you have to use this momentum to switch to something else, which is the core of the process of reinvention, which is essential for the wealth and the sustainability of the city or the region in the long run. But it's extremely hard to do, because you have to give up exactly at the moment where things are going really well. And which also means if you have a lot of stakeholders involved, local stakeholders involved in the design of the strategy of reinvention, that's going to be really, really hard to move from an industry that's doing really well today, even though tomorrow it might not, to a new one that might look a little bit volatile at the beginning, or that has a lot of uncertainty. But we know that systematically, cities that manage to move from one technology to the next, from one industry to the next, are the ones that, by definition, can reinvent themselves and strive in the long run. And this connects very well with the smart specialization strategy. So in this case, indicated by S3, which is basically a very ambitious policy of the European Commission, which is, from the cohesion policy, to help regions in this phase of transition, to really help them, to support them in this phase of transition from one technology to the next, from one industry to the next. And the core principle of this smart specialization strategy are, I think, extremely good and extremely interesting, but in practice, very hard to implement. And these are things that I'd like to discuss with you a little bit. So just if you're not familiar with this smart specialization, which is, I think, the policy that is the most directly connected to the question of resilience and reinvention of regions in the long run, this is a new innovation policy concept. It should be based on the sound analysis of regional assets and technology. So what I like about this second point is that you should not try just to aim any technology or industry, but it should be personalized. It should really build on what you're already doing in some extent. And the third one is like, it's a high value added activity. You should focus on basically going up in terms of your economic structure. So you should focus on trying to upgrade the economic structure. And these are the principles that are kind of outlined in the policy in a few academic papers. But the key issue right now is to make it concrete and develop tools that help regions all over the world to actually make this assessment of like regional assets and basically identifying high value added activities. Okay, and this is where basically the concept of relatedness and complexity will be useful. Now, the first, I think, really, really important principle, that's something I think we all agree, because it's a group on regional resilience with some urban economists, some economic geographers, regional scientists, so we kind of all agree on that. But I think it's nice to stress it again, because knowledge is very highly concentrated. If anything, in this paper that we wrote with Cesar, Sergio, and a few other colleagues, we really see the extent of this concentration, and we document the fact that this concentration has been increasing over time. Now, what does that mean? It means that, if anything, the question of resilience is a question, that is defined at a regional or city level. Resilience of a more global system is really driven by the resilience of cities and regions, but also, and more important than any kind of innovation policy, industrial policy, should be by definition place-based. So we cannot think anymore about large policy defined at the national level, at the French level, at the German level. It doesn't make that much sense anymore. We really have to take into account where these activities take place, and the borders, between these cities and these regions actually, should not matter. Ideally, should not matter at all. So this idea that innovation is highly concentrated is, of course, can be paradoxical. Some people don't believe in it because of new technologies of information and communication. But I think it's very important to carry this message, because this is just how the world is organized. And there are a lot of issues that are derived from this pattern related to spatial inequality that, if anything, are actually growing very quickly. And we have a very hard time to actually find policy instruments to limit these disparities. But all of these are like, a true pattern of our world. And this is important to keep that in mind in the overall discussion, right? So if anything, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but like, if you look at the red line, this is the concentration in large cities of the most complex technologies. And if anything, they've been increasing tremendously over the past 200 years. Now, the second one is like, whenever you think about trying to upgrade your economic structure, looking just as like value added is actually a limited factor, because you might have economic activities that today generate a lot of value added, for instance, extracting oil, but do not generate sustainable growth. And I'm not talking about sustainability in environmental terms here, but like really a growth of the economy that is organic and that depends on the activity itself. So if you think about extracting oil, you have a big premium right now because there is a high demand for this product and scarcity. But in itself, developing knowledge on extracting oil does not really open up any kind of new economic activities. It will not really open up some new discoveries. Now, if you really master, embedded systems in an airplane, it's tightly connected to a lot of new innovation and new ideas, and you can basically tap on this knowledge and develop a lot of new things. And one of the best predictor of economic growth in the long run is actually the complexity of an economic system. So in this case, and I'm going to go really fast on that, but behind economic development, and if you think at the living standards of different countries, the economic structure, which is which reflects the economic complexity of countries, is really one of the key driving force. So the economic structure really reflects some kind of living standards, and this is something that you might be familiar with. And that we see basically when we look at the level of complexity and the level of wealth, you see almost linear relationship, but also the deviation is very useful in that sense to predict growth in the long run. So in this case, what you're doing here is like you're really reframing the question of economic development from chasing GDP, chasing value added, into actually chasing complexity and focusing your policy actions into like trying to increase the economic complexity of the system. So basically, this is something where you don't really care too much about the market moves right now. You just focus on building a system that is complex enough to give you room for development and to give you an anchor towards economic growth. Now, the last principle that help us to think about this issue of reinvention is really the principle of relatedness. So once you understand that it's a pretty good idea to move from producing pens to produce smartphone, for instance, the big question is like, how do you do that? Once the concept of economic development, original development, is really about moving up, upgrading your economic structure. Like, how do you do that in practice? And the principle of relatedness has been developed. I would say like there are different schools that actually started thinking about relatedness. Actually, it's something that's evolutionary economists already started to think about in the 1980s, then being refined by some economic geographers, Ron Boschma, Kuhn Frenken, then Cesar Hidalgo, Ricardo Arsman have been actually, put some effort on actually visualizing this idea of relatedness. And it's been very useful to think about how economic structures change over time. So in this case, you have a product space, you have like different products. These are the nodes in this network, and they are connected together by a certain level of relatedness. So the links between two nodes indicate the level of relatedness between two products. And this is basically a representation of the economic structure of, in this case, of the world trade data. And it really allows us very, very well to make prediction of what a country is going to do next. And why is it useful in the question of reinvention? Because it allows you to think about what is easy to do and what is not easy to do. And this is very, very important. That I will come back to that. Now, we can also think about it as like a technology space or any kind of links between economic activities. You don't have to be limited to the idea of products. You can think about technologies, you can think about scientific fields, you can think about skills. Just to make a quick analogy, if you think about this as a language network and all these different dots of different colors, they are languages, it basically means that if two languages are connected together, moving from one to the next is very easy. So I'm French and I speak a bit of Spanish. It's very easy for me to pick up Italian. I'm in Italy right now. I understand everything without having learned Italian at all because the languages are very related. So it's the cost of moving from one to the next are very, very, very small. Of course, learning Dutch was much more difficult, still not there. And learning Mandarin or Cantonese will be a much harder endeavor. So this very, very simple principle of relatedness that tells you, like a kind of ease of move from one technology to the next becomes very useful when you have to develop a strategy in a world that is very complex and where you might have a lot of opportunities. It basically allows you to build really, truly recommendation systems that are truly personalized and that will give a set of recommendations for every single region. And this is what we've been doing and refining for now a couple of years, and we're expanding the data that we use. We're expanding the different metrics that we use as well, making it more and more precise. We're doing this work mainly for the European Commission, for the DG Regio. We also work with DG RTD, with the World Bank, with the Asian Development Bank. There are actually a lot of organizations, as I was saying from the beginning, that are extremely interested in this type of ideas to develop strategies and think about reinvention of regions. And basically, the idea here is to put complexity and relatedness together to think about the process of reinvention. So imagine that this is your own space of possibilities. So let's say that you're now, in Bari. I'm now in Bari in the south of Italy, and that would be right in front of you. That would be like the possibilities to move. So you will have, any kind of economic activity. It can be a scientific field, it can be a technology, and you can at the same time evaluate whether it will increase the complexity of your system. So you can evaluate the complexity of the upgrade potential of a new activity. So assuming you invest in biotech, for instance, where is it going to go? Your economy is going to go up in terms of complexity or not. So this is the y-axis, and the x-axis, basically tells you whether you're going to be able to do it or not. Now, this is extremely powerful because you don't need to ask local stakeholders about that. You can actually have a systematic analysis, that goes that is putting in comparison all regions at the same time, at the world scale. If you have the relevant data, so it becomes extremely useful because usually regions tend to be blind and they have a very good overview of what's going on their space, in their territory, but to compare themselves with other, world-class clusters or regions is something that's very, very hard by definition. So on this one, imagine that you're in this quadrant here, low risk, high benefits. What it means is like, imagine you have very high level of relatedness, very high level of complexity. Well, these are like basically a fantastic opportunity to diversify. So imagine now that you're a region, and you develop a smart specialization strategy to reinvent yourself, but you do not consider this technology. Okay, so think about it from a policy perspective. You do not consider this one. Well, there might be different reasons why you don't consider it. First of all, maybe you don't even see it, you know, because it might be an opportunity that's kind of hidden, and the stakeholders that tend to be at the table, you know, that decides about the reinvention, well, might not invite the more peripheral actors that actually have highly related, highly complex knowledge. So that might be one thing. Your local economy might be so complex that you don't really have a good overview of any kind of novelty, new ideas, and new possibilities, and you just don't include the right stakeholders. That happens. You can also have another a little bit more dark interpretation for it. It might be another issue, which is vested interest. So it might be the case that this technology right here might be very good for the region, but actually might disrupt incumbents. And this framework basically also allows you to flag this. You know, so imagine from an evaluation perspective, when the commission decides to give money to the regions or not, they can basically go back to the region and say like, well, that's interesting because it looks like you have great opportunities here, but it's not in the strategy. And then you can start to understand why, and maybe start to have an approach that's a little bit more inclusive and include actors that maybe never had a seat at this table. Now, this is extremely useful. Now, of course, it can also be just because it doesn't fit in the strategy of the region. You know, assume this is a very dirty technology here. You know, well, then you have a good reason for not going for it. It might create some kind of social inequality. There might be a lot of good reason for not doing it. You know, it's not like you blindly follow the algorithm and you go for this one, but it basically allows you in this entrepreneurial discovery process. It allows you to ask questions and to maybe discover new things by putting together data and local stakeholders. So this is very useful. Now another one here, high risk, high benefits, you know, will be okay. So you target biotech, highly complex, fantastic. You hit the mark in that respect. But the level of relatedness is very low. So basically here, what we do is like we raise a red flag. So that's a red flag thinking, well, it looks like you're going after the right one, but you might not have the capabilities to actually make it happen. And that happens with regions that, you know, want to become the new AI, Silicon Valley, biotech, whatever, that basically probably have a few very, very smart people there and very highly motivated in this field. But basically, if you compare to other regions, which is by definition given by this axis of relatedness, you know, which is relative, compared to other regions, well, you know, maybe you don't have so much of a comparative advantage. And that's going to be very hard to make it happen, because we know that these very highly complex technologies, as you've seen before, they tend to concentrate a lot. So it's really a winner-takes-all economy, and that makes most policy effort, you know, a failure in that respect. So this red flag is very useful. It should not be used again to say that you should not go for it. Absolutely not. There might be, you know, strategies. If you think there's been some countries absolutely leapfrogging, thinking about Israel, thinking about South Korea, but these are very, very specific situations where the lack of relatedness has been compensated by some extra linkages, by migration policy, return of migrants. So basically, the red flag here can be, you know, can kill some projects for the good reason. But you might also ask the question, well, if you don't have the related capabilities, do you have a compensation mechanism? Can be huge investments in infrastructure, can be migration policy, you know, like specific visa or whatever. Like it can be, you have a lot of different mechanisms and instruments that allows you to bridge this gap of unrelatedness. Can be also some specific connection with other clusters or regions. But you basically need to have a plan, you know, if you a very strong plan to compensate for the lack of relatedness. Now, in this level, it's a little bit less interesting, but basically, sure, I mean, here you could do it, but in a way, what's the point? You know, if it doesn't allows you to increase the complexity of your system, you might not have, you might not extract any kind of benefit in the long run. And this one here, I've seen cases of regions going for this. It's pretty interesting. They basically, you know, at the same time are pretty risky because of low level of relatedness, but also high level of complexity. This is the only case where, I mean, you will need a very good narrative to argue why you should do that. Okay, just to give you an idea, we did some work for the World Bank recently, where we try to identify the technologies of the industry 4.0. and basically where they locate. Don't worry about this axis because it was for the purpose of the project. We just look at the number of patents in this case. But you have technologies here, quantum computers, cloud computing, additive manufacturing, cybersecurity, AI, which is right here. And this is for Ile-de-France, so for the region of Paris at NAS2 level. And we basically can map more or less the level of relatedness of Paris. So Paris is like really a front runner, one of the best positioned region to become a leader in these technologies. And that's something we can measure, even if Paris will not have a single patent in cybersecurity, we will be able to measure the level of relatedness because we look at all the technologies. We can go to a level of granularity of like 250,000 sub-technologies that tells us, whether they could develop cybersecurity or not. It's a little bit like, I don't speak Italian, let's say yet, but just the fact that I speak Spanish and French just puts me in a position of being a front runner in one day developing the knowledge of speaking Italian, right? So that's very powerful because then you don't need to use RCAs that basically go to the roof if the region is small, or basically don't show up if you don't have capabilities in this specific industry because you exploit information about the related industry. So it's really just much more powerful. And you see that additive manufacturing, and cloud computing, I will not develop too much cloud computing because it's also a very small technology. This cloud computing and quantum computers, they're pretty not very robust, so I would just think about these guys here. But like additive manufacturing, for instance, 3D printing, it looks like Paris is not that strong in that respect. Now, if you think about Bucharest, I was in Bucharest last week for like the largest evaluation conference at the European Commission, where we also discussed this framework to evaluate a smart specialization. You see that, on the other hand, additive manufacturing and cybersecurity are very strong in Budapest. AI and autonomous robots, autonomous vehicles, a bit less strong in that respect. But what you see here is that for every single region, we can do this kind of mapping. Okay, so in this case, number of patents, don't worry about it. It could be complexity, could be whatever you want, could be gain in environmental sustainability, could be social justice, could be whatever is useful for the policymaker, whatever is interesting. Okay, but this axis of relatedness density really tells you whether you do have these capabilities, whether you do have this ecosystem that is ready for these technologies to grow and mature, which is extremely important information because if you don't have this data, very often you also take like a blind decision. Just to give you an idea also of whenever you start to put money in one of these technology, depending on the level of relatedness, I'm just telling you the story very quickly on this one because I want to leave room for the discussion. But basically, in gray here, these are technologies that are funded. In light gray, technologies that are not funded. So basically what you see usually, indeed, if you put money, you see the gray rectangle is always a bit taller than the light gray one. Indeed, the probability of entry, which is here, tend to go up, okay? But now the gap between the funded and not funded really depends on the level of relatedness density. So, at the lower level, if there is no level of relatedness, well, it means you can put as much money as you want, it's not gonna grow. On the other hand, if you have very, very high level of relatedness, well, maybe putting money, funding a specific technology does not really make a difference because it's going to enter anyway. Now, there are some level in between where you can have like almost like a 1 to 2 gap. And that really, like this little policy push might really make a world of a difference. That's some work we've done with a student of mine, Wolf, who is now at CBS. Now, something really, really useful, which is also based on some work we're doing with the European Commission, is to develop some kind of matchmaking algorithms where, depending on the level of relatedness of specific region, we can find the best match. So, for instance, these are the best matches for FR10, which is Ile-de-France, in the technology GO7F. Okay, so imagine let's say that we both target speaking Italian. Okay, so in that case, Italian will be this technology GO7F. Okay, and FR10 is me, okay? And I want to develop Italian. Well, assume that Italian is related to 2 languages, French and Spanish. And imagine that I speak French. Then my own level of relatedness between my own level of relatedness to Italian, so to GO7F here, will be 50%, 1 divided by 2. And imagine that someone else, like Simon, for instance, speaks Spanish and not French, then that's another 50%. So if we combine our 2 expertise, we have 2 of the two technologies or two languages related to the one we target. Okay, so I want to speak Italian. I already speak French, 50%. I collaborate with Simone, who speaks Spanish. I get an additional 50%. I basically get from her plus 50%, which is 100% in total. You know, so together with her, I get the full set of capabilities that are needed. Now, this is this indicator here that you see on the y-axis, the RD, relatedness density, that is added by this new connection. Okay, so in this case, if Ile-de-France will collaborate with that mold, okay, assuming perfect collaboration, okay, that doesn't. It's just a matter of ranking these guys. We of course know that there won't be like a perfect flow of knowledge and technology, but basically these are the potential perfect match. Okay, and that if let's say Ile-de-France will absorb 100% of the capabilities of that mold, or Emilia-Romagna, you know, it will give Ile-de-France a boost of around 40% in the relatedness density to GO7F. Okay, so that's what this graph means, and it's extremely important to also develop collaboration between regions, because part of the reinvention process is also not only looking inwards to our local capabilities, but also obviously to think about collaboration and connection, and this is a very useful tool. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation. I really appreciate your time for listening to it, and now we have a few minutes for questions, so please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much for the presentation. Very insightful. So first, I'll let everybody else some space to think about some questions before I'm asking you all of mine. I have several. So yeah, you can type it in the chat here, or you can also directly ask via the video. So if you have a question, now is the time.
So I would actually, maybe if I can say something, I'd like to hear maybe the question. That's something that could be nice. We can collect a lot of questions, and maybe you can do a screening, Simone, of like the most interesting one if you have a lot. But otherwise, I would really appreciate to hear, you know, who you are, and then hear the question formulated directly through the video.
Okay, so we got one via the chat already, which is very interesting, I think. It's Shivani asking about how do you understand that a particular industry is reaching the maturity period? I think let's make it in a way that oh, another question. Okay, let's maybe collect questions, so then we can. The second question is by Bianca. So, is it possible to join relatedness and economic complexity? Okay. Then I'm also gonna ask mine, namely, so if reinvention is important for development, but reinvention also means that there has to be already something to reinvent on. So how do you jumpstart this process in a place where there is really nothing to be related to in the first place? And
okay, Simone, just there are quite a few already. I think they're all interesting. So let me address them. The one you asked is a very, very important one, because it's really much easier to develop something if you already have something. This is the cold start problem in algorithms. Like if there is really, really nothing, what do you do? Okay, well, if there is absolutely no, I mean, I don't think there is any region in the world where there is absolutely nothing, because that would mean there is no people. So there's no people, well, who cares? Don't do anything if there is no people. Like don't, but I mean, actually, it's funny because some policymakers do that. There's no one, they set up a big, you know, $2 million research center, they put a building and they will come. Never build something and say they will come, they will not come. Okay, that doesn't work like that. Follow the people, not the other way around. Go where the people want to be, or go to where the people are. So if you follow this strategy, first of all, you avoid losing a lot of money. So you avoid like really bad strategies, and then you basically always build on something systematically. The fact that you, Simone, when you look at a few websites and a few movies, for instance, Netflix, already after like 10 iterations from you, can already give you like excellent recommendation. Why? Because you triangulate with information from other people. and you give like a very specific combination. And you can also have an algorithm that basically learns. So, you know, like even like you give a little bit of randomness, you try, and then you see how the region is following. This can all be implemented in this type of analysis. It is really very, very precise. So the probability to you know, like to develop a new industry is so much related to this concept of relatedness. It also works for very tiny tiny regions. So this is important. It can almost always be done. And to finish, no, just for a question, if there is nothing, just don't do nothing. Do nothing. That's key. Now, let me answer to the question I have in the chat. And again, you guys listening, if you want to ask your question straight away, I'd like to do that. How do we recognize that a particular industry is reaching its maturity period? You can look at, there are different ways to look at it. The first one is actually to look at trends, okay? So we looked at past patterns, for instance, going back to 1836, you know, and we looked at different trends. So when a technology was maturing and moving up, you know, basically you look at the share that this technology has in all patenting. It's the most simple one that you can think of. And what we looking at this indicator is that when you start to see a technology that have a declining share of patents, okay, it is a predictor of the decline of the region like 20 or 30 years before. Okay, so for instance, in 1920, Detroit missed the wave of electricity-related technologies, while Boston reinventing itself, moving from mechanical to electricity-related technologies. And that basically explained the decline, of, not explained, but like allows you to predict the decline in employment of Detroit 30 years after. So you can flag some kind of, just looking at trends already gives you a very, very good perspective. Another one that I think is even more powerful is the beta scaling coefficient. So basically the concentration of an economic activity in large cities. When an economic activity is like increasingly concentrated in large cities, that's usually a sign of the technology like being in like the kickstarting period and getting into a stage where the technology is very much like what everybody's trying to do and to copy. And once you see technologies where the beta relative to other technologies is going down, it means basically other places are starting to do it, which is already a signal that the technology is really maturing. So if you know, if you do biotech in 1970, 1980, biotech is highly concentrated, you know, on the two parts of the US, two coasts of the US. Now it's getting a sign of maturity, but not too mature. But like at some point, technologies always escape the large cities, and you can look at this geographical tracker to give you an idea of the maturity. It works very well. That would be my favorite. And then the level of complexity, economic complexity, can also allow you to do that. So there are a lot of ways to think about it. Theoretically, is it possible to join relatedness and economic complexity? Bianca, I invite you to ask me this question straight away, because I do not understand the question. Because theoretically, that's what I was doing with this framework. If it's because of like mathematically speaking that you mean, I invite you to ask this question and clarify. So Igor, which particularities do you think a smart should have if applied in the context of the okay, to me, it's absolutely not an issue. So smart specialization used to be an innovation policy developed in DG Research and Innovation, DG RTD, became a cohesion policy. I think the principles are great, and they actually should be in a context of the EU for regions that are trying to catch up with core regions in the EU. So in that sense, I don't see any issue in developing a smart specialization principle, which is one, the policy should be place-based, two, based on relatedness, three, complexity. I don't think there is any way to change this principle based on the on Latin American or other specific context. I do not think there is any ground to do that. So that would be my answer. Yes, okay. Now, do you think that the concept of relatedness can be applied for agricultural regions? For instance, okay, capacity of direction from some crop to another. Thank you, Fernando. This is a great question. And I am not an expert on that, but I can tell you that I have a colleague at the GRC, the Joint Research Center in Sevilla. His name is Emeric Ricom. We actually did our PhD together. And he's trying to do that right now, trying to see if it makes sense. And according to him, it does. So that is for the question. I remember something I forgot for Igor. The issue usually in Latin American countries, in some Latin American countries or other countries in Asia, for instance, where I work on, some countries like Brazil have fantastic data. Some countries like Cambodia do not have great data. And this type of smart specialization strategies based on evidence, and big data and stuff, they require data first. Okay. So if you really have bad data, it becomes very hard to make a recommendation. So this is an important point I want to mention.
All right, great. Thank you for the questions so far. I think there are more coming, but now I have another chance to ask another one, which is great. So, okay, we all know that patent data have several limitations. And how do you think, what kind of bias do these limitations introduce to this methodology right now, particularly when you think about knowledge complexity?
So basically, you said that patents have a lot of limitation, and we should think about going beyond patents. Is this your question, or try to cover?
Yes, how to go beyond, but the actual question was, so we know the limitations, and how do these limitations specifically impact this methodology?
Okay, which I understood as okay, we need to go beyond patents to cover a bit more of the economic space, but like well, it depends on limitation that you think about, because if you compare patent data to products, industries, industry data, this is just the best data we have for this type of smart specialization strategy, because you need two things to actually comply with these three principles. You need excellent data on the exact location where the technology, the industry, the skills is located. Patent data gives you inventor addresses, so that you know exactly where the people that have the knowledge on this are located. So this is what you want. You don't want the headquarter. L'Oreal is headquartered in Netherlands, but most research is done in Paris. You don't want to flag L'Oreal stuff in the Netherlands because the knowledge is not produced there. Patents will tell you where people live, and you will get the knowledge in France. Great. So that is not a limitation. It's fantastic. And there is no other data at this scale that allows you to do that, especially for industries, for occupation. And this is not survey. It's actually, like you have every observation. So I don't see a limitation for that. Second one, when you want to measure complexity, you need usually very good data on a specific technological basis that you have in each patent. Patents are classified according to, they enter into like 250,000 type of technology. So the level of granularity is very high, and the level of spatial granularity is also very high. Usually, whenever you go down in granularity at the technological level or industry level, you aggregate at national level or something like that. You have always a trade-off. Here, you don't have this trade-off, which also means that for the complexity measure we use, you can do very, very precise work. So in that respect, to me, the limitation is that you basically, when you analyze patent data, you only analyze knowledge that can be patented. Is that a limitation? Yes. Then think about all the type of data, and that's something I can develop also, because we've been thinking about this. But in itself, if you're looking at technologies that can be patented, I don't see any limitation, especially for this methodology. I see only advantages.
Okay, but just one thing. But when you think, for example, about services that the services that are the high knowledge, how do you call it? The knowledge intensive services.
The KIBs? You mean the KIBs?
Exactly, the KIBs. They don't patent much, but they're extremely important for the economy, because they provide high wage, high skilled jobs and drive the economy forward. But they don't they do innovate, but the innovations, they're not patented. So that's a problem, huh? Okay, so
that's the way I understood your question. It's like you don't cover the entire space of economic activities, and even knowledge and even innovation. I mean, 100%. I agree on that, and I think we need to very, very seriously and carefully add to this framework all the type of data sources. 100% agree. Now, let me just say that it's hard for me to think about any kind of firm that do like really disruptive innovation that does not patent. And there is also this fallacy that if you're in the software world and everything, you don't patent. Well, look at the portfolio of patents of Google, IBM, Tencent, Alibaba. All the giants of AI are like the top champions of patenting. Then you tell me, well, what about blockchain? Okay, so today there are two technologies that are disruptive. Blockchain, I will tell you, then don't use patents because you won't. Actually, you might find it's too young. Blockchain is very young. AI is old. It's like 70-year-old AI. Blockchain is super young. It's not even 10 years old. So at this stage, you don't have a lot of patents around blockchain, very, very few, but you find that in GitHub. So you have like most blockchain projects, most of the source codes, they are available on GitHub. So you can get a fantastic repository of the best knowledge and the best inventors of new technologies around this using GitHub. So depending on what you're looking at, you use data that is more appropriate. The issue with GitHub is the geography. Usually it's not great, but you can still get a good idea of what's going on in the field. And then if you think about other of these, so when I think about technologies, this is really what I think about: AI, blockchain, cybersecurity stuff. The consultants, the service providers, is like a part of this ecosystem, but it's another layer that usually does not, propose disruptive innovation products. They actually provide services, they provide consultancy, they provide like assistance. And in that respect, whether they innovate or not, I think is can be discussed. What is the impact at the at the world scale level? Can be discussed. I think it's part of an ecosystem. Definitely important in providing high wage and everything. But if you're really looking at the production of new technologies, that's not, I think, where it happens. And when it happens, most of the time it gets into patents. And by the way, the landscape of patents is not the same now in like 2000. And I see people citing papers from 2000, like on like the critiques of patent, or like 1993, on like why patents are not great. Well, the economy has changed, and today, if you look at the technology that really matters in terms of like disruption and potential of like creating a lot of jobs, think about Amazon, and look at the portfolio of patents of Amazon. Amazon is everywhere. Today, the relevance of patents, I think, one day after the next is getting higher. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a little bit more time for one more question. Anybody brave enough to use the video? No? Okay. One last question that I have. You mentioned the problem that institutional problem, basically, that when something is going good in a region, you can't stop, you can't stay there, but you have to go on. Oh, a question?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, may I ask a question?
Okay, go on, Milad.
Okay, hello, Pierre. My name is, and everyone, my name is...
Hi, Milad, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. I'm a PhD student at Utrecht University. So I have actually two questions. First of all, we have a large body of literature on network studies, and we know that the way actors are connected at the regional level is very important in terms of innovation and creating novelty. So I'm wondering if you know any empirical studies that control for the degree of relatedness and show if network structure matters in that sense. So assume we have two regions and both have the same degree of relatedness. So does it matter if one region is highly centralized and another region is like a random network? This is the first question. The second question, right now I'm working on a project on radical innovation and the drivers of radical innovation. So I'm wondering if you can give me some hints on the drivers of radical innovation in terms of relatedness and complexity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Milad. Great questions. I think, first of all, that there is not enough paper on the first question. Okay, there's been some attempts. I'm thinking mainly about some work by Frank van der Hoeden from the Kellogg in Chicago, who's been aiming at this question. But definitely, you identify a nice gap, and the interaction between relatedness and the network structure of inventors and the social structure is actually very interesting, I think, to explore. So I would say go for it. Nice gap, and we can learn a lot from it. We've done some work looking more like external networks and whether it impacts depending on the level of relatedness, whether it impacts entry or not. And we have some very, very, very interesting results that I'd be happy to share with you, but it's a little bit of a long story. But long story short, you actually find that the regions that actually collaborate with their ideal match, as we were talking about before, so you're combining connections to other regions based on the level of relatedness. So let's say, again, I speak French, Simon speak Spanish, we collaborate. It's the likelihood that we will actually develop Italian gets really strong. It beats any kind of other indicator of network connection. So we've been looking at external connections, a paper with Ron Boschma, which is now actually we're writing it. But the results are really, really nice. But now the internal network is something that I think should be explored. That's for sure. And you ask a second question. Radical innovation. It depends how you define radical innovation. I like also to understand that radical innovation is also depending radical for whom. So is it new to the world, new to the region? Is very different, right? So is it radical relatively to what you've done in the past and you really change what you've been doing, or are you really pushing the research frontier for everyone? And I think it really depends a lot in that respect. The best, I'm gonna be away from relatedness in that respect and try to think about relatedness using other spaces, not technological relatedness to explain technological breakthrough, let's say, or unrelated diversification, but usually the best predictor of developing really breakthrough technologies and disruptive technologies is actually the inclusion of science. So whenever you have patents that actually build a lot on scientific fields, because it also means there is nothing else. So by definition, it's going to be disruptive. So if you think about the major disruption of the past 30 years, let's say biotech, you look at biotech patents, they don't cite all the patents. They cite scientific stories. If you think about the Google patents, the PageRank patents, there may be one or two patents cited, but most of the citations, they go to, even sociology, mathematical sociology, network science type of articles, because they basically use the same mathematical formula, plug it into a new application, So instead of looking at connection between people, you look at connection between websites, but you compute essentially the same stuff. And it's really about using a formula that works really well in the context for a new application, and then you get this disruptive, massive innovation. So I would really try in this respect to mix scientific relatedness and technological relatedness to think about it. That would be, I think, a killer paper.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, great. I think no more questions for now. Thank you very much, Pierre-Alex. It was a really, really nice and successful webinar. And it's always good to have you with us with the YSI. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you, Igor. And thanks to everyone for joining and a great question. You take care, and I see you soon. I don't know.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Anywhere in the world.
Exactly.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.